There's a great movement of people who now realise that by their own strength and by their own militancy, they can do something about the environment in which they live.
I think about 1973, I'd come back from Canberra and I was living in a friend's house in Annandale. And they started talking about this guy called Arthur King, who had vanished. It turned out that Arthur King had been disappeared by the local mafia, at least for a few days, and had been taken to a spot and shown a big hole in the ground, so that was where he was going to end up, because he was involved in trying to stop the redevelopment, in fact the demolition of a very significant street in Sydney, that's Victoria Street at King's Cross and Potts Point. The developer was a guy called Tiemann, but he was a migrant. He came out from Austria. He said he only arrived here with $10 in his pocket or £10 in his pocket, and we used to joke, well, we'll give him £10 and send him back again, but you probably wouldn't be allowed to say that these days. So some of these buildings, all of them look to be demolished and replaced by these kind of red brick, multi-storey apartments. We were there at the invitation of the residents, and therefore we were visitors. So that gave us a quasi-legal position. But also we had the backing of the Builders Labourers Federation. Jack Mundy, who was the leader of the New South Wales Builders Federation, put a green ban on demolition in the street. Now, they had a monopoly of builders' labourers, construction workers at that time. So nothing could go ahead while that green ban remained. When I got there, I realised that apart from a lot of talk about external things, about what we're going to do about the government, how we're going to publicise the issue, I mean, there was the practical things like putting locks on the doors, repairing roofs, because the developer had got up and taken some of the cladding off the roof. People just stole the lead lining from the roof. And so water was coming in, things were broken, the electricity being cut off, gas being cut off. People drawn in from very, very many different areas. There were people, I guess, who were there simply for opportunistic reasons. One guy was living at home and wanted a place to meet his girlfriend. But strangely enough, all those people got involved. They might have gone there for reasons that weren't idealistic, but they became involved in the idea. They became part of a group. It's a bit like an army coming together and bonding, because that's what it felt like. You're under siege the whole time. Victoria Street was like being in a war zone. We were harassed by the police. The newspapers were full of all sorts of stories about orgies, drug addicts, criminals. The tabloid press were having a ball saying, we're a bunch of anarchist rabble. There were a few people disappeared. One guy was supposed to have been murdered. Later on, Juanita Nielsen got murdered because of her involvement in this issue. And we know that people associated with well-known criminals around the area were eventually hired to stamp out opposition to the development. They were the dangerous people, not us. Well, we got the tip off. We barricaded the doors, so we tried to nail everything up. We nailed ourselves in, basically. The police, for the most part, stood back while people hired by the developer, smashed the doors down. Then the police came in, arrested people, took us away in paddy wagons, locked us up. Within a day, everybody was all locked up. The developer moved in and took the place over, so that was the end of that.
There were no restrictions in those days, no regulations at all about, you know, preservation of historic housing or streetscape or any of that. A lot of those issues and those regulations came up because of the destruction of places like Victoria Street.
This is a danger for this city. The old Victorian houses that are really the jewels of Sydney, they require a lot to be maintained. Any housing requires quite a bit to be maintained, but if it's cheap and nasty, well, you can pull it down and build another one. I've heard developers, in fact I was at dinner with a guy who was a developer who said Glebe should just be torn down and rebuilt, just like that. So that's the way these people think. They don't think in terms of, you know, heritage, they don't think in terms of aesthetics, they just think in terms of utility and profit. We've got a different group which is Hands Off Glebe, where we try and involve ourselves in action for public housing and action to try and bring some of the concerns of neglect of maintenance in this area to the attention of the department. We've had a little bit of success, but not as much as we'd like. The main issue that we took up was the Calvert Street development, and because the City of Sydney were in favour of it, we didn't have much chance there. Rather than acting as a guardian of the public interest, rather than expanding the public housing for low-income people in the inner city, they've made money out of this. They've acted as a private developer.
And it was a real little integrated unit of people who'd been there probably since the 60s. That was swept away. The people were moved on, the same as their vision of society. You know, the wealthy get the best, and if you haven't got any money, well then you get the crumbs.
Succeeding in anything requires people to get involved. And the failures happen when people don't get involved. So I think it's a lesson that if people are really concerned, they have to get involved. "30 years ago, they would have fought harder because, so 30 years ago is the 1980s. Now, there were a lot of people living here then that had a family history going back for maybe 100 years. They felt ownership of this area and strong identity with it. They also didn't have a welfare client mentality. That is, they didn't feel threatened, or they were prepared to act even if they were threatened. Many of them had a history of involvement in union activities. So yes, I think they would have fought harder. I certainly don't regret what I did. I perhaps regret not doing more of it. I miss being, 22 again when I started doing this kind of thing.